Hello students, I'm your instructor, Connor Alford, and in this week's lecture, Political Science 1513, American Federal Government, is going to delve into the topic of public opinion. As with all of our lectures, we're going to begin by going over a series of learning objectives that I want you to focus on as you begin taking notes. And this week, we have 6 distinct learning objectives that I want you to pay attention to. Our first learning objective asks for you to define the term public opinion and to explain how public opinion is actually measured. Our second learning objective asks for you to describe the characteristics of a scientific opinion poll, whereas our third learning objective asks for you to define and explain the significance of each of the following terms: sample, population, inferential statistics, and margin of error. The fourth learning objective asks for you to explain the importance of representativeness and of random sampling and how surveyors achieve these goals. The fifth learning objective asks for you to explain the difference between sampling and non-sampling errors and to identify the examples and sources of each that we discuss in this week's lecture content. Finally, we will conclude with our master learning objective, with learning objective number 6. Where you are asked to interpret the meaning of and assess the quality of public opinion data and polls. I call this the master learning objective because each of the first 5 learning objectives is an important step towards achieving the 6th. If you cannot satisfy any of the first 5 learning objectives, you won't be able to satisfy the 6th learning objective either. Furthermore, if you can satisfy the 6th learning objective, well, then you can probably satisfy learning objectives 1 through 5. This then is probably the central focus of our lecture. This is the most important learning objective, and there's not going to be a particular point at which we stop and we talk about this learning objective. Instead, everything we talk about throughout this lecture builds up towards this particular objective. That being said, in order to help supplement your learning experience, I'm also going to refer you to the handout made available to you in this week's coursework folder. This handout should be entitled Everything You Need to Be an Informed Consumer of Public Opinion Data. And I want all of you to read it. In fact, you are required to read it before you progress to your assessments, your quizzes, or your discussion assignments in this week's lecture content. Okay, now that we've covered our learning objectives, let's go ahead and start with that first learning objective, and that means that we need to define the term public opinion. I'll begin by reading you a definition directly out of your textbook. So, the term public opinion can be defined as, and I quote, the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the population, end quote. Now, if you're not familiar with the term aggregate, here's what I need you to understand. Aggregate basically means collective or collection. So when I tell you that public opinion is the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the population, what I'm really telling you is that public opinion is the general set of attitudes, beliefs, or feelings that some group of people tend to share. In other words, I can tell you about how, say, African Americans tend to feel as a whole. But you need to understand that I am speaking in generalizations. Public opinion data can tell me that African Americans tend to be more likely to support the Democratic Party than they are to support the Republican Party. That's true. But it would be a mistake to deduce from this general statement that a particular black person must therefore be a Democrat. Because while African Americans do tend to register as Democrats, if they register at all, that doesn't mean that there aren't any Republicans who are also black, or black people who are also Republicans. We are talking in general tendencies shared by groups of people, and we are not, generally speaking, going to be making statements about particular individuals who belong to these groups. It's also important to understand that there's a distinction between what we might refer to as a private opinion and a public opinion. And if you've done your reading, you already understand that the most important difference between private opinions and public opinions is that you're willing to share your public opinions. An opinion that is private is one which you hold, but that you don't feel strongly enough about that you're willing to share it with other people. Whereas a public opinion is one that you are willing to share. And in public opinion, these are the types of thoughts, attitudes, or beliefs that we're going to study. Why do we focus on these public opinions and not your private opinions? Well, because we're not mind readers. I don't have the ability to read your mind to figure out how you feel about an issue. If I'm going to learn about your feelings, I'm going to have to ask you, and you're going to have to be willing to answer. If you are not willing to answer my questions, then I am not going to learn about how you feel, and we're not going to get anywhere. So when we're talking about public opinion, you need to understand first that we're talking in generalities about broad groups of people, and second, that we are only able to focus on the opinions they are willing to share with us when asked to do so. A third point that I want to note is that there are certain types of group that we are more interested in studying than others. Remember, I gave you that definition. Public opinion is going to be the aggregate of individual attitudes and beliefs shared by some portion of the population. But when I tell you that we're looking at some portion of the population, understand that there are many different ways that you can divide up the overall population into distinct portions. For example, I could divide everyone in the United States up based on their eye color or their hair color, but it wouldn't be very interesting for me to do so. Because what we're going to find is that features like the color of your eyes don't systematically shape your experiences in life, and therefore don't have a meaningful impact on the opinions that you tend to hold or the views that you tend to have about the world. Whereas other characteristics like your race, your gender, your religion, your socioeconomic status, or where you go to school might lead to some systematically different feelings about the world. So when we're talking about public opinion, we're specifically interested in the different groups of people within our population who are referred to as publics. The population as a whole can be subdivided into several distinct publics. A public is some portion of the population, united by a characteristic, which binds its various members through a set of shared wants, needs, interests, or experiences. So, for example, we can divide the general population into several distinct publics based on their racial background, because race systematically shapes the types of experiences individuals have in life, and therefore race groups tend to have systematically distinct views about the world. For example, public opinion data has shown us that African Americans are more likely to say that race-based discrimination in the workplace is still a major issue in the United States than are Caucasian Americans. Why might African Americans and Caucasian Americans tend to feel differently about this issue? Well, because they have different skin colors, and your skin color shapes how you're treated, how you experience life in our country and elsewhere. African Americans are more likely to be taught to look for racial discrimination, to expect racial discrimination, and they're probably more likely to experience racial discrimination in the workplace. Whereas Caucasian Americans are less likely to experience this firsthand and are less likely to be taught to recognize or look for it as they go through life. As a result, they don't see it as much, and it seems like less of a problem to them when you compare them to African Americans. Now again, understand, we're talking in generalities. There are plenty of white people who do feel that they are the victims of discrimination, and even if they don't feel that they are victims of discrimination, they may still say that race-based discrimination in the workplace is a big problem. Similarly, there are African Americans out there who say that it's not that big of a problem. But because African Americans and white folk have systematically different experiences in life, there are systematic differences in the way they feel about these types of issues or the ways that they answer these types of questions. So when a group of people is going to have its own set of systematically unique wants, needs, interests, or experiences in life, then we are interested in studying it. Then this group is what we refer to as a public, and now, all of a sudden, it's worth taking some time to learn about how these people feel. But how do we go about doing so? How do I learn how African Americans feel versus Caucasians? Or if we want to step away from race, how might I learn how American voters tend to feel about a certain issue? For example, not that long ago, the Gallup Institute, a fairly reputable polling organization, released numbers saying that about 87% of American voters would like a law requiring GMO products to be labeled before they could be sold in our grocery stores. But what we're going to find is that there are literally hundreds of millions of voters in our country. And it is not reasonable to think that the Gallup Institute spoke to every single one of them. In fact, I'm willing to bet that among those of you listening to this lecture are some American voters. And yet I'm also willing to bet that none of you spoke personally to a representative from the Gallup Institute. So how can the Gallup Institute make this claim that 87% of American voters support such a position when they haven't spoken to every American voter? Well, they're going to learn how we feel using what we call the public opinion poll. And the public opinion poll is a survey of opinions taken by systematically questioning a sample of individuals selected from a broader population that you are interested in learning about. In other words, it's a questionnaire that you're going to deliver to some members of your general population, and then you're going to use the answers that these individuals provide to make some general guesses or estimates or inferences about the population as a whole. Let's then break this down to some of its core constitutive components. Let's focus on the highlighted words, population and sample, because these are some key concepts that you need to understand. The population of a public opinion poll is the overall group of people or public that the surveyor or pollster is interested in learning about. In the example given from the Gallup Polling Institute, we're going to find that they made a claim about American voters. Therefore, their population is every single American voter. But because that's such a large group, it's not practical for them to speak to everybody. So instead, they're going to speak to some of the individuals in this broader population. That brings us to the term sample. The sample of a public opinion poll is the subset of individuals within the broader population of interest, which is selected to receive and respond to a survey's questionnaire. In the case of that Gallup poll, the population was every American voter. Since that is too big of a group for our pollsters to speak with everyone, they instead spoke to about 2,000 different Americans chosen randomly from around the country. And these 2,000 American voters who actually answered the question were the sample. So what we're going to find is that in public opinion polls, we use inferential statistics. Inferential statistics is the branch of statistics that makes inferences about a broader population based on data drawn from a sample of that population. The Gallup Institute does not know with absolute certainty that exactly 87% of American voters would support this particular position. But based on the best available evidence gathered from speaking to a sample of American voters, they can infer that about 87% of American voters probably support this position. So you do need to understand that this is probabilistic and it's not deterministic. I'm not saying that exactly 87% of American voters definitely support this position. I'm saying that probably about 87% of American voters support this position. You also need to understand that because we are using inferential statistics, we're making informed guesses about a population based on observations made while studying a sampling of that population. All public opinion polls are going to come with a margin of error or degree of imprecision. The margin of error is a measure of how imprecise the estimate of a public opinion poll about its population actually happens to be. So you should understand that all good polls will report a margin of error. They all have a margin of error, but only the good scientific ones will report it. And if you're ever on your own reading through a public opinion poll, but they don't report the margin of error, that's a big red flag. Now, that doesn't mean that you should dismiss it out of spite. It doesn't mean that you should dismiss it whole hand, because it could just be an oversight or a mistake, but it is a red flag. You should be suspicious. Because one reason why a pollster might not report their margin of error is that it's very large. And the larger your margin of error, the less reliable or precise your estimates about the population are. What we're going to discover is that the results of a public opinion poll are best interpreted as a range of possible values centered upon the reported integer. So for example, In that prior instance, I told you that the Gallup Institute released polling data, which showed that about 87% of American voters supported labeling GMOs. But we don't know that it's exactly 87% because the only way to make that determination would be to speak to every American voter, and that's simply implausible. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to speak to about 2,000 of them, and we're going to make inferences. But those inferences are, at the end of the day, just guesses. They're educated guesses. They're guesses informed by the best available evidence, but guesses all the same. So they won't be perfectly precise. And in this case, what we're going to find is that the Gallup Institute reported a margin of error of 3%. That means that there is a 3% range of imprecision in what they report. In other words, if they say that 87% of Americans support position X, but we have a margin of error of 3%, you, as an informed interpreter of this information, understand that what they're really telling you is that somewhere between 84% and 90% of Americans support that position. How do we get these figures? Well, the reported integer is 87. 87 minus a 3% margin of error is 84. 87 plus a 3% margin of error is 90. So the results are a range of potential values. And what they're really telling you is that somewhere between 84 and 90% of Americans probably support this position. So now we know what a public opinion poll is. And we understand that this is the primary tool that surveyors use to gather public opinion data so that we can learn about how distinct publics feel about issues. We know what a sample of a poll is, and we know what the population of a poll is. We understand that we're working with inferential statistics, and we understand that there's a margin of error. In spite of all of that, you should understand that public opinion poll data is generally a pretty good indication of how people feel. It's not perfect. It is general rather than absolute, and it is probabilistic rather than deterministic. There is going to be a margin of error. There's going to be a degree of uncertainty and a degree of imprecision. But at the end of the day, if a poll is conducted well, if it's actually scientific, it will give you a good indicator of how people feel. That's a big qualifier, however, because what we're going to find is that not all polls are conducted very well. In fact, there are a number of polls, called push polls, that are intentionally designed poorly to try and get a particular result. Why might somebody want to get a particular result? Well, there are a variety of reasons. They can use this to convince people of a political position or to hurt the attitudes of people towards a particular politician. But what you need to understand is that public opinion polls are only a good indicator of how people probably feel if they are conducted scientifically. And a scientific public opinion poll is one which avoids sampling problems and non-sampling problems. Sampling problems and non-sampling problems are also called sampling biases and non-sampling biases. So be aware of these disparate terminologies, but understand that they are synonymous. A sampling problem is the same thing as a sampling bias. And the reason for this is going to become clear, I think, as we move through lecture. But let's begin with a definition, because for our learning objectives, we do need to talk about each of these two major sources of bias in your public opinion polls. So the first major source of a bias in public opinion data is the sampling problem. A sampling problem is a problem with the sample of an opinion poll, which undermines the validity of its inferences about the population as a whole. A non-sampling problem, on the other hand, is a problem with the design or delivery of a questionnaire, which undermines the validity of a survey's inferences about the population by influencing members of the sample. In other words, you have a sampling problem, which usually results from your delivery mechanism, when, for whatever reason, the people you have chosen to speak to are not going to provide a good basis from which to make general inferences about the population as a whole. You have a non-sampling problem, which usually results from the design of your questionnaire itself or from the delivery of the questions on that questionnaire. And the non-sampling problems basically happen when you lead people to provide certain types of answers. But let's talk about each of these in greater depth, starting with the sampling problems. So remember, a sampling problem is ultimately a problem with a sample of a poll, which undermines its inferences about the population. And the most obvious type of sampling problem is that the sample might not be large enough. If your sample is too small, it will not provide you with a good basis from which to make general inferences about the population as a whole. So for example, let's say that I wanted to learn whether or not my American government students wanted their next exam to be administered in an essay format instead of the traditional multiple choice format. Well, I could ask a student, and it might be that this particular student just so happens to say, yes, I would personally like to have an essay exam. Could I, from that one yes, infer that my American government students as a whole would prefer an essay exam? No, I most certainly could not, because that sample is too small. Now, I only got one yes, and I got no no's. So I could say that 100% of the American government students I spoke to said yes, but I still could not infer that the class as a whole would like an essay exam because my sample is too small. How big should your sample be? Well, that really depends on the size of your overall population. A general rule of thumb that academics have come to is that for a nationally representative poll, you're going to need somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 respondents. In other words, you're going to need a sample of between 1,000 and 2,000 people before you can make any reliable inferences about a very large group of people, like, say, American voters, African Americans, American men, so on and so forth. But that number does seem rather low, and it is. We found it generally works pretty well, and we're not exactly sure why, but it does. And that's really all you need to know for this class. There's a whole bunch that goes into where you should draw that line, but for our purposes in this introductory level course, what I want you to understand is that if you're talking about a national poll and you have less than 1,000 respondents, that's a red flag. You should be suspicious of a poll which tries to make statements about a nationally represented group based on the responses of 8,000 or 800 members of a sample. What if they go over 2,000? That's okay. It's just a waste of time and money, because what we're going to discover is that for whatever reason, after you go past 2,000, you get a point of diminishing returns where the addition of more respondents does not do as much towards increasing the reliability of your results as it would have at a lower level. Bottom line then, first type of sampling problem is that the sample is too small, and for a nationally representative sample, you're going to need at least 1,000 respondents. What other types of sampling problem might you run into? Well, the other major category of sampling problem or sampling bias is that the sample is not representative. And you can break this category of sampling problems down into a variety of sub-issues, but generally speaking, we're going to focus on three. The first reason why you might have a non-representative sample is that you are asking the wrong people. In other words, your sample includes individuals who are not a part of your population. Not everyone in your population needs to be a member of your sample, but every member of your sample needs to be a part of your population. Let's go back to that example that I gave a moment ago about essay exams. If I wanted to learn how my American government students felt about exam format, I could ask all of you how you feel, and many of you would probably respond. Those of you who told me that you would like this type of exam over that type of exam, those of you who actually responded to my question would be a part of my sample. The population as a whole would be every American government student. But if I were to go and speak not to American government students, but to English majors in an honors course at the upper division level, and I asked them, would you prefer a multiple choice exam or an essay exam, then I'm willing to bet that a lot of them would say, I would prefer to have an essay exam. I could speak to, let's say, 50 of these students, and let's say that 49 of them said, I would like an essay exam. Well, based on that, if I have 100 government students, I might try to say, hey, look, 49 out of the 50 people I spoke to said that they wanted an essay exam. Therefore, clearly my American government students want an essay exam. But that would be erroneous, because my sample was not representative. I spoke to a group of people who are distinct from the population I am trying to study. Upper division honors students majoring in English are not going to have the same wants, needs, expectations, or experiences that my Introduction to American Government students in this survey course are going to have. Consequently, they're not going to have the same ideas, thoughts, opinions, feelings, or preferences. And so they are not a good place to go if I want to learn about American government students. If I want to learn about American government students and their preferences, I need to sample American government students. So everybody that I speak to needs to be an American government student, not an upper division English major. Okay, so the first reason a sample might be unrepresentative is that it includes people from outside of the population. But another reason why you might run into a problem here is that you are speaking to the same person from your population multiple times. And that's not good because you're going to skew your results. You're going to overrepresent the preferences of that person. The general rule is that if you are one person, you get one vote. You answer one question one time. No one individual should get to complete your questionnaire multiple times. Let's again focus on the essay exam question. And by the way, don't panic. I'm not giving you essay exams. But let's say that I wanted to know if you would prefer that. So I go and I ask one student, would you prefer a multiple choice exam or an essay exam? And this individual is an American government student, but he or she just so happens to say, you know what, yeah, I'm also an English major, and I'm a senior who just put this course off. I would love an essay exam. Okay, well, he or she is a part of my population, but he or she is only one person. So that should be the end of it. I got one yes, and now I go and I talk to 10 other people, and they all say no, stick to multiple choice, and therefore I conclude that overall my class as a whole would prefer multiple choice. But what if instead of moving on and asking 10 other students, I ask the same student 10 more times? Well, in that case, I would have a total of 11 votes for the essay exam and 0 votes for the multiple choice exam. Yet I could not conclude from this that my population as a whole, every American government student, probably prefers an essay exam. Why not? Because I have overrepresented one person. Sure, I got 11 yeses and 0 no's, but those all came from the same person. So again, don't let one person bias your results by inflating their voice and voting over and over and over again for their preference. Your survey needs to be delivered in such a way that you can ensure each person will respond exactly once. Finally, you need to make sure that you provide descriptive representation for all of the socially relevant subdivisions of the population you are interested in learning about. So for example, if I want to learn how American voters feel about labeling GMOs, well, about half of American voters are female and about half of American voters are male. So about half of my sample from this population should be male and about half of my sample from this population should be female. I have provided descriptive representation. I do not want to be systematically more likely to talk to men or include men in my sample than women, or to systematically be more likely to include women in my sample than men. Why not? Well, let's say that instead of labeling GMOs, I were interested in learning about how American voters felt about a law which would require insurance companies to cover hormonal contraception. Well, in this case, I could go out and talk to 2,000 men, and that would be a pretty good-sized sample, yay. And let's say that every one of these American men is a part of my population. They're all American voters. Great, but I still don't have a representative sample, because here's the thing. Men and women aren't going to be impacted in the same way, or at least not as directly, in this case, when we're talking about this law. Women will be impacted more directly because women are the ones who use hormonal contraception, and women can get pregnant. Because the law might affect women in a way that is distinct from the impact the law will have on men, men and women might have systematically different viewpoints. So if I wanted to learn how American men would feel about that law, fine, go talk to American men. But if I want to learn how American voters feel, I need to include both male and female voters who might have systematically different views, and I need to include them proportional to their inclusion in the population as a whole. Again, if 50% of the population is male, 50% is female, then I should include 50% of my sample as male and 50% of my sample as female. If 13% of my general population is African American, 13% of my sample should be African American, so that no one group's representation is inflated or deflated as compared to other groups or its representation in the population as a whole. And here's where we're really going to run into some problems. Because what we're going to discover is that ensuring descriptive representation, where the proportion of your population comprised of a certain subgroup within that population is equivalent to the proportion of the sample comprised of that particular subgroup, is very, very difficult. What do I mean? Well, what I mean is that it's hard to ensure that you are not systematically more likely to talk to, say, a man than a woman. Let's say that I am a teacher and I'm in a classical classroom setting, for example. And again, I want to randomly sample 10 American government students to see if they would prefer an essay or multiple choice exam. And I start calling on hands. Well, you would think that it would be a pretty easy problem to solve. I don't want to overcall on men or overcall on women, so I just randomly select people. But I might not recognize that I have some innate bias. Perhaps without realizing it, I'm more comfortable talking to other dudes than I am talking to ladies. And so over the semester, I find that without recognizing this innate bias, I've spoken more to male students than to female students, so on and so forth. That could be a problem. So how do we overcome this issue of selection bias, where the individuals you are selecting to participate in your sample are systematically distinct from those you are choosing not to include? Well, the best tool we have available is what we call random sampling. And random sampling is basically going to be when you select which members of your population you will include in your sample in such a way that you provide an equal probability of inclusion for every member of the population. So, in other words, random sampling is a technique that we can use to acquire a generally representative sample by randomly selecting members of our population in such a way that every member of that population is equally likely to be included or excluded when you compare them to any other member. So we should not be systematically more likely to select men than women, rich people than poor people, white people than black people, or vice versa. Going back to our classroom example, I can't simply randomly call on hands because without recognizing it, I might have an innate bias. But I could acquire a random sampling if I took the name of every single student in my population and I wrote these names down one by one on separate sheaves of paper. And I made sure that each sheaf of paper was the exact same size as every other sheaf. Then I folded them all up and I dropped them all in a big old bucket or in a large jar. I shook it up and I started randomly drawing names. Now, if I am using this approach, then perhaps I do have an innate bias that makes me more likely to be comfortable talking to men than women. But since I'm randomly pulling names out of a jar, that bias is not going to feature in my decision-making calculus. It's not going to affect who I talk to. So, we have a random sample. But one thing I do want you to understand is that when we're talking about a large population, when we're talking about a nationally representative group, random sampling is an ideal, not a reality. Our goal as public opinion surveyors is not to acquire a perfectly representative sample, a perfectly random selection process, but to get as close to this purely random selection process as we possibly can, and then to openly acknowledge any ways that we fall short, and to discuss how these limitations in our methodology might shape our results. So, for example, let's say that I administered a landline telephone poll where I started calling random phone numbers around the country. If I'm randomly dialing numbers, then my innate biases aren't really going to play a very big role in shaping who I wind up talking to. I will just ask my questions to whoever happens to answer the phone. But here's the deal. Laws prohibit me from placing random calls to cell phones, and I don't have a repository of every cell phone number in the country the way I might be able to acquire a repository of every landline telephone in the country. So I can't call people's cell phones. I can only call their landline telephones. And what we're going to find is that today there are systematic differences between the types of people who have landline telephones and those who do not. For example, older people are more likely to have landline telephones, whereas younger people are more likely to rely exclusively on their cell phone. So if I'm only calling landline telephones, I'm not providing young people with an equal probability of inclusion. They are going to be underrepresented in my sample, whereas elderly people are going to be overrepresented. Similarly, rural people are more likely to have landline telephones than are urban people. And again, rural and urban people, young and old people, are going to have systematically different opinions, attitudes, and beliefs about different issues. So I'm going to introduce, again, a sampling bias. I am going to select certain types of people more frequently than other types of people when it comes to picking those who I will include in my sample, whose opinions will be sent back as responses to the questions on my questionnaire, and therefore the inferences that I make about the general population are going to be skewed. And I need to recognize that. So let's say that I do administer this landline telephone poll, and I wind up overrepresenting senior citizens, as I almost certainly will. Well, in that case, I need to recognize my sampling approach, while good in certain ways, overrepresented the old and underrepresented the young. Then I need to talk about how that might affect my results. Maybe in this case, what I'm trying to figure out is what proportion of American voters will prefer a Republican candidate. And I recognize that senior citizens are more likely to be conservative Republicans than our young folk. Well, in that case, what I can say is, look, based on my poll, I find that a pretty good proportion of the population is Republican. But I'm probably overestimating the representation of Republicans because I over-included the elderly. So this oversampling of the elderly, this failure to provide young people with an equal probability of inclusion will skew my results. That's okay. I just need to acknowledge that I have not gotten that perfectly random sample and explain how that might affect my results. And all good polls are going to do this. If they don't, that's a red flag. Because remember, virtually all public opinion polls are going to have some form of selection bias, some form of sampling problem. And these sampling problems are going to result from their delivery mechanism. The delivery mechanism, by the way, is the tool or technology used to take your questions and bring them to the individuals you have selected to participate as a part of your sample. So in the previous example, my delivery mechanism was the landline telephone. But I could also try mailing my questionnaires directly to people's houses, or I could post my questionnaires on a website, or I could go and I could talk directly to these people. Personal interviews, the internet, telephones, these are all examples of delivery mechanisms, but they're all going to introduce their own selection biases. If I go on the internet instead of using telephones, I will probably overrepresent the young and the urban, as opposed to what we saw with the phone calls, which were the opposite. Why would an internet poll overrepresent the young and the urban? Because young people are more likely to have access to and routinely use the internet, and so are urban people as compared to rural people. So what we can find is that, again, all public opinion polls have some type of sampling problem, because random sampling is essentially impossible to acquire, since every delivery mechanism is going to create some sort of bias. Our job is to recognize that and to try and adjust accordingly. So now we know about sampling problems and we understand where they come from. What about non-sampling errors or non-sampling problems or non-sampling biases? Well, remember that a non-sampling error or a non-sampling bias or a non-sampling problem is really going to be a problem with the design or delivery of a questionnaire, which undermines the validity of your survey's inferences about the population as a whole by influencing members of the sample. So let's say that we did acquire a perfectly representative sample and that sample was sufficiently large. Well, we don't have any sampling problems, but if I'm not careful in how I ask or deliver my questions, I may nevertheless lead people to provide answers that don't actually accurately reflect how they or the groups to which they belong happen to feel. So, for example, two of the most common types of non-sampling problem that surveyors run into are what we call the halo effect and misreporting. The halo effect is a cognitive bias in which the impression a survey respondent has of the surveyor shapes the way he or she answers the question. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to know how somebody was going to vote during the 2016 presidential election. So I approached this individual and I asked them, who are you going to vote for? Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or somebody else? Well, if they look at me and I'm wearing an I'm with her pin, then they know that I probably support Hillary Clinton. And so they're not likely to say that they're going to support Donald Trump because they might be afraid that I'm going to judge them or try to argue with them. Similarly, if I'm wearing a Make America Great Again cap, when I go and I ask this question, that gives the survey respondent, the person I'm speaking with, an impression of what type of answer I would like to see. And what we're going to find is that people tend to try to give socially desirable answers as a way of avoiding confrontation. So if they think that I want them to say Trump, they're more likely to do so, even if they don't actually support Trump. If they do support Trump, but they think I want them to say Hillary Clinton, they might say Hillary Clinton just to avoid a confrontation or to keep me from thinking less of them. This is a big part, by the way, of why public opinion polls got it wrong in the 2016 presidential election. The halo effect led people to misreport their opinions. So when you're administering your public opinion polls, especially if you're doing this in person through face-to-face interviews, you need to think about who is asking the question and how this might lead to certain types of answer that don't accurately reflect how the respondents actually feel. One way to think about the halo effect is to imagine a pastor asking you, when is the last time you've been to church? And what you're going to find is that if it's your pastor asking you this question, you don't want them to know it's been 6 years. You want them to think that it's been relatively recent. So you're probably going to underestimate how long it's actually been if you haven't been to church for a while. Why? Because you know what your pastor wants to hear, and we are psychologically predisposed to tell people what we think they would like to hear from us. When you are administering a public opinion poll, then you need to not only pay attention to who is asking the question, but you also need to make sure that you're asking the question in a completely unloaded manner that doesn't tip your hat. The person who you are speaking to should not know what type of answer you would prefer to hear, because if they do, they're more likely to give you that answer simply to placate you. That's one of the major types of non-sampling problem you might deal with, but another source of non-sampling problems comes in the form of your question wording. Generally speaking, your questions should be worded as clearly as possible. They should be as unbiased or neutral as feasible, and you need to provide the appropriate degree of background information. So if you've done your required reading for this week, if you've read the Roper Institute's cautionary tale about the Holocaust polling error, then you've already seen an example of why your questions need to be clear. So in this instance, the Roper Institute, a normally reputable source of public opinion information, ran a public opinion poll. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to figure out what proportion of the American population harbored doubts about whether or not the Holocaust had ever actually occurred. And to figure this out, they ran the following polling question. Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible to you, that the Holocaust never occurred? So that was the question that they administered. And they found that a fairly substantial proportion of the general population harbored doubts about the Holocaust based on the way that people responded to this question. But here's the thing. Holocaust deniers are real. They're out there. But they are an extreme minority in our country. Maybe not in Saudi Arabia. But in the United States, most of us are fairly convinced that the Holocaust did occur. And by the way, we're correct. It did occur. This is a historical fact. So why is it that this public opinion poll indicated that so many of us were doubtful about whether the Holocaust had ever occurred? Well, because it was poorly worded. There was a non-sampling error. People were confused by the question because it contains a double negative and because the term possible in this sentence is extremely vague. So, for example, does it seem possible to you that the Holocaust never occurred? Well, if I were to ask that question, I eliminate the double negative. So you understand what a yes and what a no actually means in response to this question. But I could say, no, it doesn't seem possible. I know the Holocaust happened, but it doesn't seem like it should have been able to happen because I cannot comprehend how a group of people could do something so heinous to another group of people. In that case, you might wind up reporting the respondent as a Holocaust doubter, when in fact they recognize that it happened, And they just don't think that it seems possible. Obviously, they know it is possible because they believe that it did happen, but the language in this question is so vague that they gave you an answer that does not accurately reflect how they really feel or think about this issue. So again, the first thing you need to ensure when designing specific questions on your questionnaire is that they are clear. They ought not be confusing. So avoid double negatives, avoid double-barreled questions, and avoid any language that is vague or difficult for people to understand. Of course, at the same time, you need to make sure that your questions are not loaded, that they have been phrased in a purely neutral manner. And if you want to see an example of what loaded questions look like, I would recommend you take a look at some of the videos that I've posted in the optional resources folder for this week. Because what we're going to find is that the way you word a question can dramatically change the way that people respond to that question. If, for example, you ask people, do you generally identify as pro-life or pro-choice, you're going to find that about half of the American public says pro-life and about half of the American public says pro-choice. Now, these numbers vary. Sometimes the pro-choice side has a slight advantage. Sometimes the pro-life side has a slight advantage. But by and large, they tend today to be fairly even. However, if you worded your question poorly, you might get the impression that an overwhelming majority of the American public supported one position over the other. And to illustrate this, I'll use a couple of real examples of abortion polls. One was run by a pro-life lobbying organization, and it asked, do you support a law allowing for abortionists to murder unborn children? And what they found was that an overwhelming majority of the people responding to this question said, no, I don't think that the abortionists should be allowed to do that. I am pro-life. And only a very small number of people said that, yes, I do think that we should allow this to take place. Why? Because they worded the question in a very biased manner. Nobody wants to say that they support murdering children. That's not neutral. And because they worded this in such a loaded manner, the respondents knew what answer their surveyors were looking for, and they just told them what they wanted to hear. On the other hand, you could get the opposite results, as happened when NARAL, the National Abortion Rights League, released a public opinion poll where they asked people, as it pertains to abortion, do you think that the government should control what women do with their own bodies? And based on this wording, they found the opposite. They found that an overwhelming majority of Americans were pro-choice and supported abortion. But of course, again, that's not true, because it's about 50-50 if you ask the same exact question in an unbiased manner. So it's important that your question is neutrally worded, because if you have a biased question, then the responses you're going to get will not reflect how your respondents feel. They will reflect how your interviewer feels, how you feel. You will get the answers that you are looking for. And that's not a good scientific opinion poll. Great design for a push poll, but not a good design for a scientific opinion poll that actually and accurately reflects how your population feels or thinks about an issue. Finally, depending on the type of question you ask, you might need to pay careful attention to the amount of background information that you provide in your question. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to know how you felt about the policies of former Mongolian President Sigyaji Nobukadorje. And I asked you, do you generally approve or disapprove of how Sigyaji Nobukadorje ran his country? Well, the fact of the matter is that you probably don't know who Sigyaji Nobukadorje is, and you wouldn't really have enough information to give me a meaningful opinion. So one of two things are going to happen. Either you're going to check a random answer box or you're going to skip the question altogether because you just don't have enough information to give me a meaningful response. Well, either way, I haven't learned how you felt. And if I wanted to figure out how you feel, then I would need to start by providing you with enough background information about the types of policies that Sigyaji Nobukadorje implemented in order for you to form an opinion. So I've got to give you a little bit of background information to work with so that you can figure out how you feel. But I have to be careful because I can't be selective in choosing what type of background information I provide. If I only ever told you about all the horrible things that Sigyaji Nobukadorje did, you would probably think that he was a horrible president. But if I only ever told you about the good things that he did, the successes he experienced, you would think that he was a great president. I need to be balanced. I need to give you a fair summary of his presidency that does not erode or ignore any elements of the truth. At the same time, I don't want to give you too much or too little background information. If I give you too little background information, then I'm wasting my time because you still don't have enough info to make an informed decision or to actually formulate an opinion. And if I give you too much background information, you're going to get bored of the question and you'll stop reading. You'll check a random box or you'll just skip it. So there's a tightrope. You want to give people enough background information that they can form an opinion and give you a reasonably helpful response to the question. But you don't want to provide so much background information that you're inadvertently leading them to provide certain types of answers, or you're causing respondent fatigue where they just give up on the question altogether. So those are some big things to focus on when you're wording questions. Another thing that you might need to pay attention to, depending on what questions you are asking, is whether or not your respondents are going to feel comfortable admitting their opinions, thoughts, behaviors, or beliefs. If you are asking about a substantially controversial or incriminating issue, if you're talking about a sensitive subject matter, you also need to make sure that your questions assure respondents of their anonymity, that they are articulated in a purely non-judgmental manner, and that the respondents feel safe in the environment where they are being asked to respond to your questions. So, for example, if you're asking about an issue where somebody runs the risk of self-incrimination, you need to make sure that they know that their answers aren't going to be used against them in a social or in a court arena. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to know whether or not somebody had ever cheated on their current spouse. Well, this is something that a surveyor could be interested in learning about. I want to know about the prevalence of extramarital affairs. But if I started walking up to random men and women and asking them with their spouse in full earshot, have you ever cheated on your current spouse? Well, I'm not going to get honest answers, because if they admit right in front of their husband or wife that they've cheated, then they're probably getting in trouble. They have incriminated themselves, and so they're just going to lie. They'll say, no, of course, I would never do that, even if in fact they had, and otherwise would have been willing to admit that for the purpose of science. So I need to ask these questions in an anonymous environment where the respondents know that their answers cannot be tracked back to them. And I need to ask these questions in a way that doesn't make them feel attacked, or again, they might lie. Remember that halo effect. It's going to play a very big role. If you asked a woman, have you ever murdered one of your unborn children? She's not going to say yes. Even if she's had an abortion, she's not going to say, yes, I murdered my unborn child. Because it's a really mean way to ask that question. That's a very judgmental way to phrase that question. But if you ask that same woman, have you ever happened to have an abortion at some point in your life? Well, you've asked that question in a way which allows you to gather the information you need, the prevalence of abortion, without making the respondent feel judgmental, so that they feel like they need to give you a misleading answer. Finally, what we're going to find is that you also need to think about the ordering of your questions. So not just the wording of your questions, but the ordering of your questions. You do not want to ask your questions in a way where the topic of one question becomes the central focus of how somebody answers the next question. And again, to see an example of why this is true and what it would look like, I would recommend that you watch the Leading the Prime Minister video in this week's optional resources. But let's say, for example, that I wanted to learn how people felt about firearm control, about gun control in our country. And what we're going to find is that there are a number of very neutral ways that I can ask this question. Maybe I'll ask, do you generally support or oppose increased gun control or firearm regulation, something of that nature? And that's a pretty innocuous way to phrase the question. But what if right before I asked you, do you tend to support gun control policies or not, I asked you, do you think that rising gun crime or violence in our country is a problem? Well, then when you're trying to form an opinion, decide how you want to answer my question about gun control, you're going to be remembering what I just primed you to think about. Gun violence. And if when you're forming your answer, when you're deciding where to stand on this issue, how to respond to this question, all you're thinking about is gun crime, then of course that means you're more likely to say that you support gun control, even if in other circumstances you would say that you opposed more gun control. Conversely, if I spent a whole bunch of time talking about tyrannical governments and about the Second Amendment and then asked you whether you support gun control, you would be more likely to say you oppose it, even if in other circumstances you would say that you supported it. I need to ask my questions in such a way that the topic of one question does not affect how you respond to the next. You need to also make sure that if you're going to ask about a controversial topic that might change the mood of your respondents, you do so at the end of your questionnaire, not at the beginning. And again, all of this has to do with what we call the anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is when you tend to focus on the topic of one question in responding to another question. So if the information that one question presents you with, or the mood that one question puts you in, influences your psychological state before you go into the next question, then our second question's not going to capture a good, accurate response. In other words, order your questions in whatever way allows you to get the opinions of your respondent on each question independent of every other question. Now that we've talked about your questions and how poorly worded or ordered questions can lead to some non-sampling biases that skew the results or alter the answers you receive from your respondents, we need to talk about answers and answer options, as well as the order in which these are presented in. Why is it so important to think about your answer options? Well, remember that most public opinion polls are probably going to be multiple choice. You can't simply ask people to tell you how they feel without giving them any guidelines, because if you do that, then they're going to provide you a whole bunch of very meandering essay responses that may or may not respond to the question that you're actually looking for, and you could get confused or bogged down. Now, if you have the resources and manpower to sift through and decode all of these essay responses, fine. Most of us don't, so most surveys are going to be multiple choice. They're going to ask you a question, and they're going to give you a set number of answers to choose from. And what we're going to find is that if you have not designed those answer options well, you can run into some problems. What are the qualities of good answer options? Well, your answer options need to be, number one, mutually exclusive. Number two, they need to be exhaustive. And number three, just like your questions, they need to be clear and unbiased. What do I mean when I tell you that your answer options need to be mutually exclusive? Well, I mean that there ought not be more than one correct answer for any particular respondent. For example, let's say that I were to ask you, how many times do you eat on the average day? And your answer options were A, 1 to 2 meals a day, B, 2 to 3 meals a day, or C, 5 or more meals. Well, the problem that we're going to run into here is that if you eat exactly 2 meals a day, then you could answer either A or B, and that would be equally correct. And since you don't know which one is more appropriate, you're going to check a random box and you're going to move on. That's confusing to respondents. A better way to ask this question might be, how many meals do you eat per day on the average day? And have the answer option A, 1 to 2, B, 3 to 4, or C, 5 plus. That would give you mutually exclusive answer options. Those answer options would also be exhaustive, because everybody who responds to your question is either going to eat 1 to 2 meals, 3 to 4 meals, or 5 or more meals. There's no option that you have ignored. And that brings us to that second quality. Once you've ensured that your answer options are mutually exclusive, they don't overlap, there's no multiple correct answers for one respondent, you need to make sure that they are exhaustive. When I tell you that your answer options need to be exhaustive, what I mean is that there needs to be a correct answer choice for any particular respondent. Let's go back to my example about the former president of Mongolia, Sigagin Elbegdorje. If I were to ask you, do you approve or disapprove of the way that President Sigagin Elbegdorje is running a country, and your only answer options were approve or disapprove, then you would either skip the question or check a random box. Why? Well, because the correct answer for most of you is, I don't know, or I don't have an opinion, because I have no idea who Sigagin Elbegdorje is. And I haven't given you that option. I'm forcing you to choose that you either approve or disapprove of a guy you've probably never heard of. So again, you're either going to leave this blank, or you're going to check a random box and you're going to move on. But either way, I have not learned how you actually feel about Sigagin Elbegdorje. So this is a poorly designed set of answer options, because they are not exhaustive. Finally, remember that your answer options, just like your questions, do need to be articulated in a purely neutral, non-judgmental manner. So, as an example of a poorly designed public opinion poll question that I took from an actual poll, let's consider the second bullet point on your slide. This question said, should Donald Trump release his tax returns? And the answers were yes, the American people have a right to know, or no, the American people should be kept in the dark. Now, I don't even need to provide you with any background information about this issue. You can already probably guess what answer the people who ran this public opinion poll were trying to get. They obviously want you to say yes. They don't want you to say no. And to ensure that you don't say no, they included this additional language. The American people should be kept in the dark. Why was that language included in this public opinion poll? Well, because it's a push poll. They want you to say yes. And you as a respondent can figure that out. Nobody is comfortable saying the American people should be kept in the dark. Everybody is comfortable saying the American people have a right to know. So the answer options are leading, they are biased, they are loaded, and that therefore introduces, again, a non-sampling bias, problem, or error where the responses you get are not actually reflecting how your respondents feel. The respondents are simply telling you what they think you want to hear. So it might give you a lot of information about how the pollsters feel, but not how their respondents feel. That's not a scientific opinion poll. So here's the bottom line. Here's what you need to understand. A well-designed survey is one that prompts honest answers which actually and accurately reflect how the respondents, not the interviewers, feel. And it is only useful if you take this well-designed survey and deliver it to a good sample. A good sample is sufficiently large relative to the overall population and includes a representative random sampling of the population as a whole. If you have satisfied all these conditions, you have a good public opinion poll. Now, do remember that no public opinion poll is perfect. Your idea is to get as close to this ideal as possible and to acknowledge any ways that you fall short and to discuss how these might affect your results. But based on what I've told you here, what you've read from your handout, your textbook, and from the other sources made available to you in this week's coursework folder, at this point, you should have all the information you need to be a reasonably well-informed interpreter of public opinion data. Thank you, and have a nice week.